JuLeigh, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. Thank you for coming this morning. We're starting the second day of our conference. We had a really amazing day and a just incredibly moving lecture last night, our first keynote from Melissa Harris-Perry, and we're getting ready for our next keynote this morning. I also want to thank Frank Dawson and the Black Cultural Center for allowing us to use their beautiful space today. So just a few reminders before we get started. We're using, if you use Twitter, use the hashtag #PoliticsOfHealth, but be sure the P and the H are capitalized, otherwise it will go to a Swedish group, which is fine, you could do both, but we would also want it to go to ours. Other reminders, so today we have lunch in an alumni hall from 1 to 2:15, and that will also be the time when we're having our poster session. In addition to scholars from Vanderbilt and outside of Vanderbilt, we're also proud that we have a lot of our MHS students who are presenting their research as Medicine, Health, and Society fellows. So please be sure to go to that. And then at the end of the day, we're having a reception from 4:45 to 6 in the MHS suite in Calhoun 300, and everyone is invited to that, so we'd love to see you there. So now I will turn it over to Sarah Ago, who will introduce Bryant.
Good morning and welcome to everybody. It's already been a terrific conference, and that will continue, I'm certain, this morning. I've been warned that I had very little time for an introduction, which is a good thing because I could go on at great length about Bryant Simon, our speaker today, who is a friend but also a leading, really one of our very best historians of the U.S. South and of labor, who in unusually, I think, wide-ranging scholarship has given us new ways to think about the modern shape of work, consumption, race, place, and most recently, food. His research has taken him from the mills of South Carolina to the boardwalks and casinos of Atlantic City to the coffee shops of the Starbucks empire, which many of you are imbibing this morning. And today he's going to take us to Hamlet, North Carolina, where in his forthcoming book he traces this story, and here I'm going to quote him, of the deliberately hidden costs of cheap government, cheap food, and cheap labor in the United States and around the rest of the world. So I give you Bryant Simon and Chickenization and the Perils of Public Health in the South.
Thanks so much, Sarah, Jonathan, Justin. Thanks for having me. Yeah, last night was inspirational. I'm not sure I have much inspirational to say about chicken. It'll be the downer story a little bit, but I think nonetheless a kind of important story. Can you hear me all right? Does this work? So over the last few years, as Sarah said, I've been working on a book about the worst industrial disaster in North Carolina history. And this is a kind of remnant from it. It tells the story of the deaths of 25 workers in a chicken plant in Hamlet, North Carolina. They died there behind locked doors after a hydraulic line hastily fitted together with the wrong part burst and sprayed fluids all over the place, igniting the unshielded burners under a 300-gallon fryer. In 1981, when Emmett Rowe, the owner of this factory that made chicken nuggets and tenders for Shoney's and Long John Silver, bought the plant and moved his operations there from Pennsylvania, chicken, and this is kind of part of my story, had become the South's largest agricultural product, bigger than tobacco in North Carolina, peanuts in Georgia, cotton in Mississippi, and all the crops combined in Alabama. Just think about this for a second. In many ways, then, the story of chicken is a bigger part of the post-1960s Southern story than the ones told of the New South by those gleaming glass towers in downtown Atlanta, Charlotte, and of course Nashville. It generated in 2000 $9 billion a year annually and employed around 200,000 workers. But the story of chicken's ascendance to the top of the Southland's economy was always a less conspicuous story than the ones told by those glass towers. And yet, I want to suggest that this covering up again and again today, I want to suggest this was by design. There was a kind of hiddenness to this story. But a transformation like this, replacing a region's main cash crop or industry, also entails the transformation of rural communities, social relationships, and I want to suggest public health. Fields and ecology, people and animals became critical sites in the rise of chicken. They became places of continuous innovation and struggle as entrepreneurs, scientists, and industrialists battled to extract ever more value from the land and from animals' bodies and from people's bodies. Now, the rise of chicken has been told pretty well by sociologists, historians, journalists, including there's a great send-up by John Oliver of the chicken industry. But what hasn't been told is the public health side of this story. And again, this is in part because the rise of what the naturalist Annie Potts has called poultry capitalism, or what the journalist Christopher Leonard has called chickenization, has never been framed in this way, as an assault, I will argue, on the environment and on the bodies of the people of the rural South in the years after 1970. But again, this is what happened as chicken spread and became the South's chief agricultural product. It created a public health crisis. One more thing about this public health crisis of chickenization. This was not just a problem of recognition or a failure to connect the dots, something I'll try and do over the next few minutes. It was deliberately made to be deliberately hard to detect. Late capitalism, what some have called reverse Fordism, the same late capitalism that led to the rise of Southern chicken and to those glass towers downtown, deliberately hides its footprint. In fact, I would argue that what this world of cheap commodity production produces perhaps more than anything else is an excess of dissimulation, or in economic terms, of externalities. It outsources the costs and consequences of what it produces onto taxpayers, especially the poor and vulnerable, and onto local and state governments, even as it depends on a public ideology of limited state action. This speaks to another aspect of the poultry health crisis, the public health crisis of poultry capitalism. Poultry capitalism might seem on the surface like the product of a declining state, but actually it's the product of an activist state that assumes more and more of the costs in order to retain business in a competitive environment. That's the politics part here, and something I'll come back to at the end of my talk. So let's just talk about chicken for a second. This is the key. The reason why chicken triumphs is it becomes cheaper. This is, and just one kind of fact, in 1923, chicken cost more than lobster. But in 1987, chicken cost the same in actual dollars as it did in 1923. It's a kind of amazing story, how cheap chicken became. And it became cheap for a lot of reasons, but two kind of central reasons that I want to look at here. And one is basically the concentration of production. Essentially, chicken growers produced chicken factories, places where they would go grow millions, and we're talking millions of chicken in concentrated areas. And so, from 1970 to 2000, the number of chicken producers declines, but their output increases, right? A classic story of increased production and efficiency. And this will reflect that, and this is, there are endless numbers of these pictures of chicken farms, right? Even though in many states it's illegal to actually take a picture of a chicken farm in one of the kind of crazy laws that we've developed. Again, another kind of concentration, right, of production. And we're going to come back to this because this is one of the key sources of the health problems produced by chicken is the concentration of growing. And really the word is animal factories, right? These are animal factories in the fields. The second key thing is that the chickens themselves are transformed during this period. They are, in fact, their bodies are industrialized. And it kind of begins in 1946, A&P sponsored the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. And the reward went to the person who grew the most efficient breed of chicken. But it turned out that they had something in mind when it came to breeds that they valued. And they were breeds that produced a lot of white meat. Americans, and this is similar to what Warren Belasco and others have talked about prefer white meat to dark meat, white bread to dark bread, right? And essentially what happened is chickens were produced that would produce more breast meat. We get bigger, faster. And I can show this in any number of ways. The key thing about this, and here's another one of these, and you can read this stat while I'm talking about it, but chickens, the amazing thing about this is chickens got bigger, faster, requiring less feed. This is, again, an industrial miracle in many ways, on par with the Model T. What went on, and I will share with you just one kind of brief kind of set of statistics. In 1928, it took 112 days to raise a 2.8 pound chicken that ate roughly 12.5 pounds of grain on the way. 40 years later, it took half that time, and the chickens themselves were twice the size. And this is the stat, right, that if a 6.5 pound baby was born and raised the way a chicken was, it would weigh 600 pounds by its third month. Just to get a sense of what's going on here. All right, so I want to talk just a little bit now. I want to just turn and talk about the public health kind of consequences of this. And these all revolve, and I want to start with the environment. They all revolve around the concentration of the production of chickens in one place. Which means two things. One is chickens and the production of chicken relies on a tremendous amount of water. One of the most heavily subsidized products that we have. The second thing is chickens produce an incredible amount of excrement and urine. And most chicken factories have little way to get rid of it. So what are the consequences of this? And I just want to share one kind of quick story. Franklin County, Georgia produced in the 1980s about 250 million chickens a year, which is as much fecal material as the city of Philadelphia. So where does that go and what happens with that? That's an environmental problem, a health problem. So the first thing that results from this are respiratory problems. People who live near chicken factories have trouble breathing. Now the key, and I'm going to say this again and again, is that the chicken manufacturers pay none of the costs of this. The second thing about this is people who own houses near chicken factories watch the value of their houses decline. And we all know this, we heard it last night and we'll hear it again, poverty is a public health issue. Wealth, the easiest way to assume wealth in this country, obviously racialized in most contexts, is through home ownership. If your property is devalued through nothing you did on your own, right, you're liable to certain kinds of, you're vulnerable in certain ways. So let's just kind of play this out a little bit more. Waterways near chicken plants, and this is also true of pork, which basically assumes all of the structures of chicken by the 1980s. A third of the drinking water in places near chicken plants is compromised. Compromised by nitrates and phosphates. Now what does this mean to people? It means they can't drink the water out of their tap. This obviously itself is a public health issue. The response to it, right, is to buy endless cases of bottled water at Walmart, which creates its own back channel, right, in the trash system. And any of you who've been to developing nations, right, where water is compromised know that one of the huge problems is what to do with all the bottles of water that people use to sort of play with their own health. The second thing that happens is about 70% of the water near chicken plants is unfit for swimming or fishing. And an interesting consequence of that is that when all of the feces and urine get in the water, right, it sucks up all the oxygen in the water and creates what people call fish kills. And this is an interesting thing. One economist charted that basically what chicken did by killing off fish was raise the price of fish. The healthy alternative, as I'll talk about later, to chicken. So by destroying the waterways in which fish was raised in, it raised the price of fish and made chicken a dangerous product more expensive as an alternative. Again, one of the kind of solutions to certain kind of public health issues is fish itself. So again, and the last thing, the science on this is a little dubious, but one journalist, and I would say muckraking is probably fair here, has linked some kind of incidence of blue baby syndrome to the amount of feces and urine in waterways near chicken plants. So again, these are health consequences about the raising of poultry that we rarely kind of associate with it. And I want to talk now about another kind of important part of the dynamic of raising chickens and raising cheap chickens. And this depends remarkably in the plant itself upon the speed up. In other words, making workers produce more so that the products themselves become cheaper. And this is related, the kind of health issues here are actually related again to feces. I promise after this I will leave feces. I may say shit once just because it seems appropriate for this. And I will leave this, not that it will be any happier, but I'll leave this. And so one of the problems going on here, right, is in order to produce cheap chickens, you got to produce them faster. And so this involves all kinds of kind of technological and workplace changes. And one is the way the chickens are killed. In order to kill chickens faster, slaughterhouses tended to drag chickens through an electrified bath. And they wanted to stun the chickens to death. The problem was if they stunned them with the right amount of electricity, it would leave a burnt taste in the meat. So they often didn't stun them at a high enough rate. And the chickens could feel they were being killed, and in their panic, they would defecate. But that meant all of the chickens were dragged through what's called a bath of fecal soup. Now, the problem here is about foodborne illnesses, right? One of the chief cause of foodborne illnesses, another public health issue, is the bacteria from fecal material. Now, the issues get kind of even more complicated here. Those chickens that we saw that are so big and so kind of productive themselves, they didn't figure out a way to grow their bodies bigger and make their legs stronger. So that often chickens, when they get to full weight, their bodies collapse their legs. That means that they're forced to live the last miserable moments of their life laying down in their own feces. And they develop sores that the feces enters. And so these two sources that are about increased production lead to foodborne illnesses entering the bodies of chickens at alarming rates. And I'll just give you some of the alarming rates. In 1980, according to the USDA, 35% of chickens were tainted by salmonella. And we'll just look at salmonella here because there's a whole host of fun diseases. By 1990, this number had gone to 50 or 60%. And according to Consumer Reports in 2009, 90% of industrially produced chicken had traces of salmonella in it. Salmonella obviously makes people sick, diarrhea, nausea, undiagnosed. It can be not fatal, but can really sort of, create kind of wretched results in your system. Now, the other thing going on is as production was ratcheted up, support for the USDA went down. And the USDA, by law, is supposed to check the carcass of every bird slaughtered in a chicken plant. There is no way that they can. So it's actually the lack of government, again, that allows for the production of cheap chickens that are not regulated in any case, that passed on to us are foodborne illnesses. Again, a public health issue related to this kind of triumph of chickens. All right, let me turn to another aspect here of what I think we can consider a public health crisis about chicken. I'm going to just read for a little while. The poultry house, slaughterhouse speed up brought on what I would argue is another public health crisis beyond the processing of dirty and spoiled meat. But this one is rarely talked about as a public health issue. As a chicken plant director told the investigative journalist Gabriel Thompson before he started to work undercover in a slaughterhouse, quote, you'll be using muscles and nerves and tendons all the time that you normally don't use. It's fast and it's hard, and your hands are going to swell and ache. He advised him to take ibuprofen every 4 hours, again, a cost that someone else bears. But that only managed the pain. According to this report from 1989 from the Institute for Southern Studies, 2/3 of employees at poultry plants across North Carolina suffered from some form of repetitive stress injury. Meat packing in general represented one of America's most dangerous jobs. According to the celebrated investigative journalist Eric Schlosser, the author of Fast Food Nation, 1/4 of the nation's slaughterhouse workers suffer from job-related injuries. And I think this is actually probably low. The most common ailment, as most people know, is carpal tunnel syndrome. What happens when tendons swell and they pinch the nerves in the wrist. It's kind of like a version of wrist sciatica, if you want to think about it. Now let's just look at one person. Betty Harper worked in a plant in Macon, Georgia. And within a month on the job, she began to feel a burning and itching numbness in the palms of her hands and the tips of her fingers. 8 months after she started, her hands began to ache and tingle. From there, things got worse. The swelling continued until she felt waves of shooting pain up her arms at night and couldn't sleep. Another public health issue. During the day, she could feel the strength of her wrists fading away. Eventually, Harper went to the doctor. He charged her around $30 that she didn't have, to tell her to take painkillers, B2 vitamin supplements, and wear a splint that cost $30 and was unavailable in her hometown. He advised her, moreover, to take frequent rest breaks, and I love this, redesign her workplace. Of course, this wasn't going to happen. Companies weren't going to listen to doctors, and they weren't going to invest in this kind of rearranging the factory without a government agency with some muscle to make them do it. And when a worker like Betty Harper couldn't work as fast as she was told to work, she quickly became a worker without a job. Eventually, people like Harper's bodies broke down. They just couldn't reach up to the line anymore to remove entrails or load another box of chicken tenders. No matter how hard they pushed their bodies, they couldn't do it. Across the country in the early 1990s, according to the United States Department of Labor, poultry workers left their jobs at 5 times the rate of other manufacturing workers. Some stayed and took the punishment, but their wrists stung, their hands locked up, and their backs wouldn't bend anymore. Some relied on workers' compensation when they could, which was actually under attack through most of this period, and health insurance if they had it, or they could afford it, to deal with their injuries. Bob Hall of the Institute of Southern Studies said years later about the poultry industry, it's the reverse of industrial development. In the 1980s, places, small towns across the South celebrated when firms like Perils, the one that owned the Hamlet plant, or Purdue came to town, and they called Frank Purdue and Emmett Rowe, the owner of the Imperial plant, in a kind of tribute to Mitt Romney, job creators. Yet in the long run, poultry jobs generally took healthy people and used up their bodies. It was a replay of what happened to Jurgis in the jungle. Upton Sinclair wrote about Jurgis in the beginning. He had been fresh and strong, and he had gotten a job the first day, but now he was secondhand, a damaged article, and they didn't want him. They had worn him out with their speeding up and their carelessness, and now they had thrown him away. Scores of robust women and men raised on cotton and tobacco farms broke down after a year or two on the chicken line. Many were maimed like Jurgis and like the birds they processed, and often put on disability at a cost to everyone, it seemed, except the companies that were supposed to be doing the industrial development. And this actually happens when another transition happens, if you think about it. Unemployed workers with their bodies broken down by the 1980s became not sources of sympathy, but they became couched as problems. Again, not as consequences of economic restructuring or relaxed workplace rules. Rarely were they portrayed as hurt or maimed or in a sense, the thing we needed to eat cheap chicken. In Ronald Reagan's America, they were welfare mothers in Cadillacs, or idle men on street corners. They took advantage of the system, it was said, and became dependent on welfare. They didn't want to work. They were less than full citizens. They needed to be disciplined. They needed to learn the value of work. They would be taught. Money would be withheld. But no one outside of a few advocacy groups talked of repairing the bodies of workers, sacrificed in the name of cheap chickens for everyone. This was by design, again, made invisible, their bodies and the cost they paid. So I want to just turn to one other kind of story about, this is just about how chicken's getting cheaper. But I want to just focus on one moment for a second, 1987. It's a kind of signature moment in American eating. It's the moment that chicken overtook beef to be the #1 meat-based protein in America. And this is a really, if you study food and eating, it's a pretty historic transition. And again, there are two reasons for this. One, chicken was cheap. And I'll talk about a little bit about the appeal of cheap. And second, through the 70s and 80s, consumers of food were being barraged with warnings about red meat and the effects of red meat on heart disease and other ailments. And they turned to chicken. But I have to say that chicken's moment of triumph was from the very beginning precarious. And part of it was its moment of triumph was the problem. Those big bloated chickens, their ugly pale white color, are pretty tasteless. JuLeigh, a child, famously would never use an American chicken. And so there was a flavor problem for chicken. And the second was chicken, unlike beef or pork, right, lacks all the different cuts. It lacks kind of marbled meat and bacon and all this other stuff. And so people in the chicken industry at its moment of triumph started to talk about chicken fatigue. And this was a very real problem, and this problem was addressed by this Cornell professor. This is Robert Baker. When he died, the New York Times called him the Thomas Edison of chicken. And Baker's real life was basically, Baker's an interesting character, but one of the real central things that he was preoccupied with was developing responses to chicken fatigue. And he kind of was like, I don't know if you know, he was kind of like the particular kind of alcoholic that tries to concoct drinks that taste like alcohol. He tried to concoct chicken products that taste like pork or beef. And among these, he developed chicken pastrami, chicken chili, chicken hash, something called chicken loaf, that's like meatloaf, he said, chicken links, that looks like pork sausage, and chickalola, that's chicken bologna that's white, according to Baker. But his most famous invention was the chicken nugget. And this is, again, a really kind of amazing invention. And it became very quickly, in the late 80s, this is actually a Tennessee story, McDonald's introduces the chicken nuggets at 5 Knoxville restaurants, and people go nuts for them. And franchises are calling, they want chicken nuggets. And by the 90s, people are calling chicken nuggets the hot dog of America, the new hot dog. It really was a food sensation, and it also addressed the real profitability problem for chicken producers because it used scraps, like the hot dog, and you can make profits on scraps. It actually also revolves on subsidized water, the biggest ingredient in a chicken nugget in early ones, before all white meat chicken nuggets was water. And so this was a key invention, but really what the chicken nugget did was solve the problem of chicken fatigue. Because it developed a product that had crunch, what tasteologists call mouthfeel, right? It's very satisfying to bite into, and that the body feels the rewards like a potato chip, right? There's this new book called The Dorito Effect that talks a lot about this, but there's a real satisfaction to it. It's also loaded with fat and sugar, which we increasingly know are addictive products, right? And the key to the chicken nugget, though, is the sauce, right? It adds the sugar for the great trifecta of fat, salt, and sugar, but it also allows you to change the taste whenever you want. Now, obviously the sauces are subsidized through cornstarch, right? And so chicken nuggets become this huge business, right? And again, a very interesting transformation happens. And that is, if you look at this chart, by the late 90s, half of the chicken we consume is fried. in various ways. So that chicken, which initially was seen as a product, as a healthy alternative to beef, becomes in fact a more dangerous product. Now, much of that was covered up, and it's hard to remember this, that most people thought that chicken tenders and chicken nuggets were the healthy alternative to steak or pork at the time. And again, this is about government action. The government does very little to challenge that notion of chicken for a long time. And so I want to just, I know these are familiar to most of you, and I want to throw up this slide, and I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the transformation of chicken and what some people have called and admittedly challenged as the obesity crisis. And I want to offer a kind of spin on this that I think is important. And I wish we had better tables here because, obviously, right, we can see the link here between the spread of obesity since 1986. This is also the very moment that wages go down in America. This is at the very moment, right, in which families, working families in particular, are increasingly hard pressed. This is also the very moment, right, when we begin to really see the development of food deserts. And I think if we had finer grain kind of recording here, I'm pretty sure about this, we would also see, right, the overlay of poverty and of dangerous kind of weight gain. And in a kind of interesting twist in the story I'm telling, of the 25 people who died in the fire in Hamlet, 18 of them could be described as overweight by the way in which the CDC does BMI rates, if you can tell from the death notices. And I think what happens is that chicken nuggets are cheap foods. And this, again, I think coincides with the kind of drop in wages, but what it really meant that people who were at the margins were hard-pressed to find the largest and best delivery of calories they could find. And increasingly, this happens at the moment when there's a kind of veneration of choice in America, but there's in a sense no choice if you're at a Piggly Wiggly in Hamlet, North Carolina. The choices, if you're making minimum wage, will lead you inevitably down the aisles of dangerous food. And the dangerous food that many parents wanted were chicken nuggets. They were the cheapest, most easily consumed dangerous food they could find. And parents have told me that I interviewed, they picked them over hot dogs because they thought they were healthier because they had chicken in them, right? And so I want to make at least a kind of tenuous kind of link between a kind of, and you can see the South on these charts, right? Between the public health crisis in the South over kind of elevated BMI rates, and we can again talk about this is a really kind of sticky and dangerous topic, but also the introduction of cheap foods that prey on people who are making low wages. This is the only choice they have, or one of the few choices they have in this kind of market. And I know many of you know the kind of statistics about this, but a quarter of all American health care costs, by some estimates, are related kind of issues of obesity, which adds up to around $1,200 per person per year. Again, we can talk about that. So I just want to turn in the last few minutes. I think we're doing fine time-wise, right? Yeah, we're doing fine. I just want to turn in the last few minutes back to politics. The kind of theme of one of the themes, at least, of the conference, and I want to argue that the story of chickenization, of agricultural change, and of the systematic exploitation of land, labor, animals, and people, and of the attack on the health and well-being of the region was about politics. Now, the conventional narrative of the years after 1973 in the South and in the United States focuses on the rise of the right and the veneration, worship really, of the market, and of the ethos of government, in Ronald Reagan's words, that government is the problem, not the solution. But really, and I think the story of chicken makes this clear in a public health, this is an era of continued government action and of continued state intervention. Government, in the form of support for R&D, for instance, to develop those freakish chickens, to allowing chicken processors to jack up poultry line speeds, to the gutting of the budgets of the USDA and OSHA, added to the profits of chicken producers. So too did the lax enforcement we saw of environmental regulations. Again, I want to argue actually that government deregulation is a form of government action. But the biggest support for business was on the back end. Government systematically picked up the bill for the healthcare costs and consequences of chickenization. More to the point, through its strategic inaction, it allowed someone else to pay. Dirty pens and loose sanitary policies caused salmonella, but poultry capitalists didn't take care of those costs. Chicken excrement leaked into water systems, but Tyson didn't clean it up. In fact, this is kind of remarkable, in the 1980s, Tyson's got millions and millions of dollars of tax breaks because it technically was a family-owned business. It was, a mom and pop operation. The speed up destroyed laborers and put them out of work and on public assistance. Yet government and staffed employment bureaus throughout the South continue to steer new groups of people, African American women largely and new immigrants from the South, towards the chicken plants, towards low wages, and to the start of the cycle of ill health all over again. And chicken makers sold cheap chicken parts, shaped like trains and cartoon characters, to schools across the country, themselves facing budget cuts for noontime meals, and in the process introduced kids to a highly addictive product that contributed to a lifetime of ill health and, again, public costs to take care of it. It was these externalities, perhaps more than anything else, including biological and business innovation, that made poultry capitalism profitable. But these same externalities and costs push public health initiatives, often aimed at dealing with the side effects of the industrialization of the southern countryside, off the table. As states and governments sagged under the weight of back-end support for business, tax cuts, and declining federal support, they cut support for school lunches again, money for recess, for research on carpal tunnel syndrome, and for environmental protections and workplace safety inspections. In 1991, when the fire happened in Hamlet, North Carolina, the number of USDA inspectors in North Carolina meant that a factory would be inspected once every 57 years. So there was no incentive, right, to follow any of the laws. Yet, when public health, and this is, I think, what's important, public health and safety advocates asked for money to invest in research on carpal tunnel syndrome, or for more USDA inspectors, or for more money for school recess, they were told no. Why? Because they were told there was no money. The logic of no investment in worker safety and public health because there was no money, although there was always money in southern states, always for road building and industrial recruitment, was often based on the logic of budget deficits. How could government spend more money when it owed money? But this math, of course, refused to acknowledge the central role of government in creating the ill health of southern society and of driving up debt by paying for it on the back end to begin with. That lie is the key to understanding the rise of chicken and the troubling, crippling, and too often unacknowledged costs of cheap labor, cheap food, cheap government in the recent South and in public health. That lie is what keeps the system going and the public at risk. Thank you. I have no idea what time it is. Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
I love it. I can't wait for the book.
You might be one of the few outside of my house. Yeah, thank you. Soon, hopefully. I finished the draft, so we're close.
But I'm going to ask the obvious question.
Yeah.
In what way is this a Southern story?
Mm.
So, I mean, having lived in Tennessee for 30 years, I know that lots of industries are lured here with these incredible tax breaks. But is there anything more than that you would want to elaborate on?
Yeah, but that's an important story, right? And so it is a Southern story in the sense that after World War II, the chicken industry dramatically moved south. The interesting thing is now it's moving back north, in part because increasingly parts of the north resemble the same vulnerabilities, that the South long had, and the same willingness on the part of the state to become, in a sense, the broker for business, right? I mean, recruitment is a dicey term, right? It's essentially the state's in the business of creating opportunity. So the South adopts this at a particular moment of its own vulnerabilities, right? And lures industry, and it doesn't really even lure. Like in the case of the plant in Hamlet, they're not, very few recruiting in southern states is aimed at something like a chicken producer. But the very same conditions that that chicken producer is looking for are what they use to lure others, right? And so, and that's what happens. And it's also about the way in which, I mean, it's really an important part of the post-war story. Actually, North Carolina becomes the most industrial state in the country in the 1980s. And it becomes industrial largely because of the industrialization of the countryside and the creation of a whole series of essentially vulnerable rural monopolies over labor markets. And the South just figures that out, you know, I mean, Southerners figure that out, and there's relatively good transportation, and so the industry moves south. And again, I think what's interesting is how chicken and pork actually begin to move north as places in Iowa begin to resemble the South, right? So it is a Southern story, and I think the other part of the Southern story is the way in which the South is actually, in some ways, from the 1940s on, kind of anticipating some of the logic of kind of global capitalism. And that, and at the heart of that is the ability of global capitalism to allow capital to move, but to move where it can find monopoly. I mean, the key is the monopoly over a cheap labor supply, which a rural community gives you, and in part because of lots of reasons why. And it's not just about kind of, it's about the ways in which poverty make people less mobile, right? And therefore stuck in that one place. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not so interested. I mean, I was interested because I was asked to talk about the South, but I think the Southernness of it needs to be put in play with, in a larger story. And this is not one of these kind of, well, you know, Southern exceptionalism stories. I mean, that I don't want to sort of argue. Yeah, Jonathan.
So building on that, maybe I was wondering about the role of race in the story.
I mean, the role of race, I think it's actually kind of interesting. I mean, the role of race in the story I'm telling, and I kind of deliberately put it to the side in this, trying to sort of frame it a little bit differently. In the early 80s and 90s, chicken is produced largely by African American women in the South. And as they push back a little bit in the way industry does, they are replaced by new immigrants from Mexico and Central America. But I actually think there's a slightly different and kind of ironic development going on here. And it's one of the kind of unintended consequences of the civil rights movement and of the women's movement. Actually opens up the supply of labor for business, in a sense allows them to sort of not discriminate for cheap labor. And so there's a kind of way in which, again, the civil rights movement and the women's movement create larger pools of labor as male wages are going down that allow these kind of low-wage employers to exploit. So there's a story about race, but also a kind of interesting, I think, unattended part of the story. Jonathan left, so I can just generally direct these comments. Yeah.
So my question is, in what ways are mechanization and technology moving into this chicken space? And if they're not, what forces are sort of preventing that from taking place?
Yeah, that's a great question. These are relative, I mean, so there's some differences here, right? There's a variety of kind of mechanizations within southern slaughterhouses and what are called further processors. And those are the people making nuggets and tenders and stuff like that, right? Basically, slaughterhouses get to be bigger during this period. They're more highly capitalized, and they tend to be a little bit more technologically advanced. But again, if you go back to my thing about labor being cheap, and generally the story is when labor's cheap, there's no incentive to put in technological changes, right? And they're trying, right? They're trying to basically like do the chicken parallel to the square tomato. Living bodies defy a certain kind of mechanization, right? Because they come in different shapes, they respond differently to things. so again, at the top end, like the Purdue's and Tyson's are investing as much as they can in mechanization, particularly as they find any pushback from labor. This is a very familiar story, right? These guys, like at the lower end of the food chain, of the production chain, who employ 300-400 people, they can't afford to mechanize. And therefore, they are vulnerable to any price change. They can't afford to abide by any laws because they'll be at a competitive disadvantage. They're crippled and weighed under with debt for the most part. Again, something you need for mechanization. So they just rely until they can't do anything more on extracting as much as they can out of cheap labor. And they know that the workers have no place to go, right? And so they use that as a form of control. There is often a racial dynamic to this. Most of the plants would have white supervisors and foremen in largely African-American workforces. And so there's a kind of, troubled kind of dynamic in that place. But again, mechanization, and I want to actually make another argument here, is I actually don't think that that's the kind of decisive, I tried to make this argument, decisive factor in the profitability. I think the decisive factor in profitability is the way in which they're able to mobilize their access to a deliberately negligent state. And that's the Southern advantage at this point that will become the advantage of Iowa. Like this plant that I'm writing about, they move from Pennsylvania. Now think about this. You have an undercapitalized plant. This guy's got 250 employees. To give up on a factory, to invest $200,000 in a new factory in 1980, that's how crucial the labor dynamic here is in getting cheap labor. And he's willing to make that gamble to get cheaper labor. But cheaper labor is only defined as cheap if there's no state regulation, right? So he's actually under assault by OSHA in Pennsylvania. It's really interesting. And his OSHA violations don't travel with him. That's how ineffective this system is, right? They're mainframe computers. This is not a hard thing to do. He opens the same name factory in the same, with his as the only shareholder, and it's never inspected. The crazy thing about this, there's if the factory's this big, there's a little ice cream plant that shares a door with it. It's inspected 4 times in the period between when he opens it and the fire, and they're not actually allowed, but they never walk through the door. This ice cream company makes like 6 barrels of, 6 gallons a year or something. It's like some ridiculous, and it's inspected 3 times.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk.
Thanks for inviting me.
Definitely.
He was once my graduate student. It went on to clearly a nicer environment.
I'm interested here in whether this is a story of Big Cluck, or does this story transfer to like free-range chickens and the sort of like smallholderization of farming as well? Does deregulation follow free-range and organic chickens and artisanal chickens?
Well, the interesting thing about chickens is why they don't raise chickens in large numbers is they're really susceptible to disease. Farmers knew this, right? This is why self-sufficient farmers had 6 chickens, because they knew if they had 10, they increased the kind of rate of disease. And this is a real challenge, right? There's all kinds of other health issues related to the drugging of chickens. But backyard chickens have been really susceptible to disease as well. Look, backyard chickens are not an answer to this problem. They are a way in which people are getting outside this kind of logic for themselves, right? But they're not scalable in a way that can answer this problem. And so, and in some ways, they're a depoliticized answer to the problem. It's a political problem, and to me, can only be solved politically. It's not an issue that and it also, I use this kind of Fordist link, right, because I think there's a link, it's sort of the idea of Walmart workers getting off their shift and walking right back into Walmart and buying everything there because it's all they can afford. There's a little bit of this with the workers in these plants, right? And both time, labor, and investment constraints mean that they're not going to grow backyard chickens unless they have a piece of land. And the last thing you probably want to do, most of you do is if you work all day battering chicken is go home and kill a chicken, and most people don't. I don't know. I just don't think it's a kind of it's an interesting development in food, but it's a less interest, I think, than this kind of larger question. Yeah, and then
I'd be really interested to hear you talk about global capitalism. So if you look down the street, right, we now see a lot of things that used to be produced in the United States being produced offshore, right? Suppose there's no governmental solution that serves our current firms and they go offshore, right? Because you could imagine sort of other countries being quite tolerant to these also environmental problems. We see it with the technology industry in China. So is there a way to think, so what are your thoughts on that?
well, I mean, I actually think this is in part a story about, you know, a kind of. I actually don't think about globalization necessarily as best described by something that exists between two countries or abroad. I mean, what we think of globalization, or maybe neoliberalism, is a certain process, right? And you know, interestingly enough, there's a very similar story happened 2 years ago in China that happened in Hamlet. You know, a chicken plant blew up that had never been inspected. It was making cheap chicken. You know, the American dumping of, basically American dumped chicken onto Mexico, creating a crisis in the domestic chicken industry there that pushed thousands of Mexican workers back to the South to work in chicken, right? I mean, so there's a kind of global story about it, and there's a global story, I think, about, to me, the big global story is about the vulnerability and the health issues that it produces, right? And the nature of kind of this bargain, right? One of the larger arguments I make is it kind of as the kind of state arrangement that valued relatively high wages and reasonably priced goods broke down, and the idea that the pie would get bigger and it should be shared with everyone to drive consumption. After 1973, it's sort of like the pieces of the pie the pie's gonna stay the same, at least the cost of those pieces should be cheaper. And I think more and more states adopt that model. Both, I mean, states like within the United States and states like government entities elsewhere. And this is what I was saying about the South, in a sense, is a kind of preview of what's going to happen. And it's kind of government kind of consciously creating these vulnerable labor markets that people can exploit. I think it's been, in a sense, this might be the South's great export, right? Kind of preview. And some people will talk about that. I don't know how far I want to go with that, but that's the way I would see it, rather than kind of, well, that's...
Okay, I think unfortunately we have to stop there. Thank you so much to Bryant Simon.
You're welcome.
Thank you, that's terrific. We're going to take just a 5-minute stretch break really quick, and then we're going to start with our next panel with Professor Ward.
It was so nice meeting you.
It was great. Thank you.
We should consider
Thanks, Bryant.
Thanks, JuLeigh.
we'd love to see you.
I would love to come. I don't know if I know enough to do it, but
Oh my God, I mean, something like this would be perfect. We're very, very well
I'm sure I would know.
So do we need anything? Just go to the empty.